There are a couple of somewhat more specialized ways of implementing compression that may not necessarily occur to people to try in day-to-day use, but they can come in handy in certain situations. One possibility is the option for MS processing on stereo tracks.
It comes here every day.
For anyone who might not be familiar with it, MS stands for mid-side. It's a way to separate the mono sum of the left and right signals, the audio that's panned center in a stereo track.
It comes here every day.
From the difference between the left and right sides, typically wide, spacious elements like reverb and room tone, and any hard panned items that play mostly out of only one speaker. This separation is accomplished via phase cancellation, and then the mid and sides of the stereo signal can be processed independently. In fact, you could set this up with any compressor with a little extra work duplicating and phase flipping a stereo track in the mixer. But if the plugin itself offers it at the push of a button, it'd be much more practical and much easier to implement. Mid-side processing is probably more associated with mastering than mixing, but a lot of mixers end up also handling the mastering as well. And MS can also be useful on some stereo tracks in the mix, especially ones that contain several elements like a drum kit. For example, let's say you had only a simple stereo drum track to work with, no individual drum mics, and you felt the kick and snare might benefit from some compression, like you'd often do with multi-mic'd recordings. If you apply a compressor to the entire kit, your only option in this case, it might be that by the time you dial up an appropriate amount of compression for the kick and snare, the hi-hats and cymbals may end up being overcompressed. Too much wash, too in your face. Mid-side compression could be the ticket. Enabling it should separate the usually centered kick and snare, the mid, from the typically wider positioned hi-hats and cymbals, the sides, with somewhat more independent compression now possible for each of these two signals. For this stereo drum kit scenario, you might choose not to compress the sides, leaving the hats and cymbals alone, and apply compression only to the mid, where it could now be applied more aggressively to the kick and snare primarily, without overly affecting those cymbals. Or you could do the opposite. If that same stereo drum track has a little recorded ambience in it, and you wanted to bring that out just a bit more, you could use MS compression to compress and then crank up only the sides. This can have the effect of both widening the stereo image by emphasizing the spread, and making whatever subtle ambience was there a bit more prominent. Naturally, if you apply MS compression to the full mix, or in a separate mastering stage, you can do the same kinds of things, processing typically centered elements like drums, bass, lead vocals, and solo instruments.
It comes here every day.
Or emphasizing the sides for spread and ambience in the mix as a whole.
I see her look at my face.
If you wanted to implement MS compression and your preferred compressor doesn't include the option, you can set it up yourself in the mixer. You'd make 2 extra copies of the stereo track. The original would be switched to mono. This will be the mid signal. Each of the other 2 will have both sides panned hard left and right. Then in one, you'd flip the phase or polarity on one side, say left, and in the other, you'd flip the polarity of the opposite side. Then you can run these 2 through a subgroup, which will make up the side signal. Now you could add a compressor to either mid or sides independently. MS compression may not be the kind of thing you'd use regularly in either mixing or mastering, but don't forget that the option is there for those occasional situations when it might prove useful.